laughter was never meant to be cruel. It burst from Mira like a final shield, sharp and brittle, the last sound of a heart refusing to surrender. The court had barely begun to recoil from her rejection when her strength vanished. In the same breath that carried her defiance, her body betrayed her, folding inward as if the bond she had denied had reached through her blood to claim its debt. Kael caught her before she could touch the marble floor. The moonlight pouring through the palace dome seemed to freeze in the air as the Alpha King held the woman who had just undone him. Around them, the royal court shattered into movement and sound. Nobles clutched their jeweled collars in disbelief, priests crossed themselves with trembling hands, and rival alphas studied the fallen girl with hungry calculation. What had begun as a coronation had become a spectacle of weakness, and in a world ruled by power, weakness was blood in the water. Yet Kael did not release her. He lifted Mira against his chest, ignoring the murmurs that rippled outward like poison, ignoring the counselors who spoke of protocol and consequence. The weight of her in his arms felt heavier than armor, not because she was burdensome, but because every step carried the echo of a past he had tried to bury. Her head rested against his shoulder, her dark hair fanning across his skin, the same hair that had once brushed his cheek in quieter days before crowns and wars had stolen their names from each other. The palace corridors opened before him as if remembering their king. Servants flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide, their hearts beating to the rhythm of scandal. Behind him, the court dissolved into chaos, whispers becoming oaths, alliances shifting in the space of a single breath. Somewhere in that storm, enemies were already counting the cost of his devotion. The healers were summoned in frantic waves, their hands shaking as they examined the girl who had dared to reject a king. They pressed herbs to her lips, traced symbols across her temples, poured their knowledge into a body that refused to answer. Mira remained suspended in a stillness deeper than sleep, her pulse faint, her breath barely disturbing the air. Then the silver light appeared. It shimmered beneath her skin like moonfire trapped in flesh. Faint at first, almost imagined. Then growing brighter with every moment, Kael remained near. The healers drew back in terror. None of their records spoke of such a sign, yet every ancient instinct in their bones recognized it as something forbidden, something lost. Kael saw it too, the glow rising and falling with her breath, marking her as something far beyond the broken girl the court had always believed her to be. The sight hollowed him with equal parts fear and wonder. He had spent his reign mastering battlefields and bending packs to his will. Yet nothing in his crown had prepared him for the possibility that Mira carried a legacy older than his throne. The night deepened, and the palace that had celebrated him hours before now held its breath in dread. Mira did not wake. But in the stillness before dawn, when even the guards outside her chamber began to doubt their senses, her lips parted. The sound that slipped free was barely more than a sigh, shaped in a language that had not been spoken for centuries. And yet Kael understood it in his bones, because it was his name, called not by the woman he knew, but by every version of her that had ever loved him before the world taught them how to lose. The sound of his name drifting from Mira's lips did not fade into silence. It lingered in the chamber like a spark searching for fuel, and when Kael leaned closer, the silver glow beneath her skin flared in answer. The air thickened, vibrating with an energy that had no place in the living world. It was not heat and not light, yet it pressed against the senses with the weight of something ancient stirring from a long, unwilling sleep. The healers retreated in fear, leaving Kael alone with the woman whose breath now seemed to command the room. Every time he drew near, the radiance within her brightened, as though recognizing him beyond the limits of flesh and time. The bond he had spent a lifetime denying was no longer content to whisper in his blood. It had found its voice, and it was speaking through her. By morning, the palace archives were in disarray. Scrolls older than the throne itself were dragged into the light, their brittle edges crumbling as scholars unraveled histories buried by kings who feared what they recorded. In the dust of forgotten eras, they found the truth that had been erased, a bloodline born not to kneel beside rulers, but to bind them. The first Lunas had not been queens by marriage or ceremony. They were sovereign forces, living seals forged by the moon to tether alpha kings to fate itself. Mira carried their mark. The revelation hollowed Kael in ways battle never had. He remained at her side while the court buzzed with terror, watching the subtle rise and fall of her chest, remembering the girl she had been before crowns had driven a wedge between their souls. He remembered stolen moments in ruined villages after war had stripped the world bare, the way her laughter once sounded without bitterness, the way his hands had fit around hers before power taught him to let go. Now that forgotten intimacy returned like a wound reopening, because he finally understood that loving her had never been a choice. It had been a summons echoing across centuries, waiting for him to answer. Beyond the sealed doors, the kingdom shifted its weight. Rivals spoke in hushed corridors of a king undone by a woman. Ambitious heirs traced maps of the capital in candlelight, calculating how long the Alpha would remain distracted by a girl who glowed like a prophecy. The court that had once bowed to Kael now studied him as something breakable. Inside the chamber, the silver light pulsed with a steadier rhythm, rising whenever he brushed too close, fading when he forced himself to step back. It was as if the bond demanded his presence, even while warning him of the danger it carried. Then Mira stirred. Her body arched as though pulled by an invisible tide, the glow exploding outward in a violent surge. Her eyes flew open, not in recognition, but in terror, and the sound that tore from her throat shattered the fragile calm of the room. It was not his name this time. It was the truth Kael had buried deeper than any battlefield, ripped free from the part of him he had never let the world see. The truth Mira tore from the silence did not belong to the present. It belonged to a battlefield long erased from record, to nights soaked in ash where Kael had been something less than king and far more than monster. The sound of it rippled through him like a blade drawn across old scars, because no one alive should have known those moments, not the choices he had made in the dark when survival had demanded betrayal. Her awakening was not a return to consciousness, but a violent collision between past and present. Mira's eyes searched the chamber as though it were a war zone, her body trembling with memories that did not fit the fragile stillness of the palace. She did not see the crown or the guards, or the healers hovering in terror. She saw fire falling walls. The night her family vanished beneath a sky that never mourned, and she saw Kael leaving. The bond that had whispered between them for years now burned with unbearable clarity, dragging every buried emotion to the surface. He felt her grief as if it were his own, felt the echo of a promise he had broken when the war demanded he choose a kingdom over a girl who loved him without conditions. History remembered him as a hero who had ended the conflict with ruthless brilliance. Mira remembered him as the man who had turned his back while her world collapsed. Worse still were the fragments she carried that Kael himself had denied. He had convinced himself that certain acts had been dreams twisted by exhaustion, that certain orders had never left his lips. Yet Mira named them in broken breaths, unveiling nights when mercy had been sacrificed for victory, when he had signed death warrants with hands that did not shake. Those memories had been buried by loyal scribes and rewritten by bards who sang only of triumph. Now they lived again inside the woman he could not afford to lose. The palace felt smaller with every truth she exposed. Kael remained near her, despite the fear knotting his chest, because distance made the bond ache like a wound torn open. The silver glow beneath her skin dimmed when he tried to step away, flaring in protest when he returned, binding them closer even as the space between their hearts filled with poison. Love, regret, and fury braided together until none of them could be separated. Beyond the chamber doors, the council gathered in urgency, their faith in their king wavering with every whispered report. A woman who could recall erased histories was not a miracle to them, but a threat. A Luna who could expose the rot beneath the crown was not a blessing, but a weapon waiting to be turned. By the time Kael felt the shift in the air, the decision had already been made. The council no longer debated whether Mira was dangerous. They had decided she was. The clatter of armor on marble heralded the council's decree. Soldiers advanced through the corridors, eyes cold, weapons poised, their intent clear. Mira was to be seized and silenced before her knowledge could fracture the kingdom. Kael did not flinch. Every instinct honed on battlefields, every lesson etched into him by conquest and betrayal, screamed obedience, yet he did not obey. Instead, he drew his blade, the silver catching the moonlight. A silent warning that none of the king's men would claim her, while his heartbeat kept time with hers. The air between them thickened with tension, the court dissolving into chaos as a loyalty splintered. Guards who had once sworn fealty to the Alpha hesitated, unsure if the man before them was their king or something far more dangerous. Kael's eyes never left Mira, and in that gaze she felt the tether of their bond tightening as if it were a chain wrapped around her soul. She could sense the power that slumbered in her veins stirring, sensing that danger and devotion were one and the same. They moved swiftly, silently, the familiar corridors of the palace giving way to forgotten passages carved into shadow and stone. Tunnels once trodden by queens and exiles, hidden beneath marble floors and behind secret panels, became their refuge. Kael led without hesitation, his presence a shield and a beacon, while Mira felt the first tremors of the force within her, responding to him. It was not her, yet it was her, a will unbound, bending the air, stirring the dust, making the very stones hum with recognition. Every step she took beside him amplified it, every breath synchronized with his, and the palace that had seemed so solid began to feel fragile under their passage. Outside, the kingdom roared with uncertainty, rumors of the king's betrayal rippling like wildfire. But inside the tunnels, time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to the pulse of the bond and the distant echo of pursuit. Mira's fear and awe mingled with the faint silver glow coursing under her skin. It surged when Kael was near, soft at moments of hesitation, yet unstoppable when they moved together. She was awakening to a force that had been dormant for centuries, a legacy written into her blood, and she realized that proximity to him was the key to its magnitude. They emerged into the ruins of an ancient temple, a place the palace itself had long claimed as legend, said to be the cradle of the first Luna. Moonlight spilled through the crumbling arches, illuminating mosaics cracked with age, symbols half erased but still resonant with power. The air smelled of dust and forgotten prayers, of blood long absorbed into stone. Kael drew Mira closer, both shielded and exposed by the skeletal remains of the once sacred hall. And then the shadows moved. Figures stepped from the fractured walls, their numbers vast, their intent unmistakable. The ruins had been a sanctuary for centuries, but tonight it became a trap. There was no time to hesitate, no room for doubt. Every instinct Kael had cultivated sharpened to a singular purpose: protect her at all costs. Mira's awakening power pulsed through her, answering the bond that had drawn them together. Yet the enemy had them cornered in the very heart of the Luna's origin. The wind whispered through the temple's broken arches, carrying the weight of history and the threat of what was to come. And in that suspended moment, Kael understood they were standing not just at the edge of stone and shadow, but at the threshold of destiny itself. The ruins waited silently, yet as Mira took a hesitant step forward, the ancient doors shuddered and creaked open without touch, as if recognizing the pulse of her presence. Moonlight spilled over the threshold, illuminating dust motes that hung like suspended stars, revealing mosaics and murals long hidden from mortal eyes. Symbols swirled along the walls, not random decoration, but a language carved by hands that had known power, loss, and devotion in equal measure. The temple remembered. It remembered her. As Mira's gaze traced the fractured murals, the memories that had lain dormant beneath centuries of survival and denial stirred, peeling back the layers of time. She saw herself not as she was now, a broken woman navigating the treacherous corridors of power, but as she had been countless lifetimes before, fierce, luminous, and irrevocably tied to Kael. There were moments of tenderness frozen in paint, battles fought side by side, kisses stolen under silver moons in eras long erased, and the echo of farewells that had carved sorrow into her soul. Each fragment clawed at her consciousness. A tidal wave of love remembered and loss relived, of bonds severed by fate only to be reborn again and again. Kael remained behind her, silent and unwavering, yet he could feel it. The air around Mira thrummed with recognition, and he understood in his bones that this was not the first time they had stood at the edge of life and death together. Their love had never been born yesterday, nor the day before. It had been interrupted, rewritten, and hidden in the folds of time. Every glance she cast over the murals carried the weight of centuries, and every shiver that ran through her made the bond between them flare, tying them together with a force that no law, crown, or enemy could sever. The temple seemed to respond to her awakening. Stone whispered underfoot, shadows twisted into shapes that mirrored memories. And the silver glow beneath Mira's skin pulsed brighter, casting a light that illuminated their shared history. The air itself bent around her, brushing against Kael as though acknowledging that this was a power tied not to the present alone, but to the endless echoes of who she had always been. Yet amid the brilliance and revelation came a darker truth, a vision that seared her mind with unbearable clarity. In one of the possible futures she glimpsed, Kael fell into her arms, lifeless, his blood warming her hands while the world crumbled around them. The memory was not of a past life, but of a destiny she had yet to face, a fate that could be rewritten, but only if she embraced the depth of her power and the truth of the bond that had pulled them through centuries. The weight of that vision pressed against her chest like the tide of every loss she had ever suffered, and for the first time, she understood that running from destiny had never saved her. It had only delayed the reckoning. The temple held its breath with her, the walls alive with memory and expectation, and Kael felt the gravity of it too. The knowledge that the love they shared was older than kingdoms, deeper than war, and far from complete. The past, the present, and the future converged in that silent hall, and Mira, standing at the heart of it, finally realized that she could no longer escape what had always been hers. The memory of Kael's death lingered in her mind like smoke clinging to ruined walls, sharp and suffocating. Mira saw it with the clarity of a future yet to be written. Every detail burned into her consciousness. The weight of his body, the tremor of his last breath, the world collapsing around him as if the very earth mourned his fall. Her heart recoiled at the sight, yet the vision was not a prophecy she could ignore. It demanded action, demanded that she confront the force that had haunted her across centuries. For the first time, she understood that fate was not absolute. It could bend, but only if she seized the strength rising inside her. She stepped back from him, though the bond refused distance. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, to spare herself the agony that loving Kael had always brought. Her pulse thrummed in unison with his, a tether she could neither sever nor deny, carrying his fear and his longing into the core of her chest. She fought it, tried to convince herself that retreat was survival, that avoidance could spare both of them from ruin. Yet every movement only deepened the connection, every heartbeat a reminder that destiny had never sought her permission, it had only been waiting for her to claim it. Kael did not retreat either. He moved with the patience of someone who had known her for centuries, someone who had endured the cycles of love and loss that her soul carried. He felt the tremor of her fear, the weight of her visions pressing against her mind, and yet he stayed, offering only the anchor of his presence. The bond flared in response, no longer just a whisper in their blood, but a roaring pulse that refused to be ignored. Mira's power stirred around her, bending air and light, brushing against Kael like a caress and a warning at once. Every instinct she had cultivated to push him away faltered under the tide of emotion they could no longer hide. Passion ignited between them like wildfire in a drought. It was not gentle. It was a force of inevitability, of centuries of longing and repeated losses compressing into a single instant. The heat of the bond surged through them both, burning away hesitation, fear, and even regret. It was the same force that had shaped kingdoms and toppled kings, now embodied in their embrace, in the electricity that danced across the space between them. Mira's resolve hardened. If destiny demanded suffering, she would defy it. If the bond called for sacrifice, she would wield it instead. And then the world intruded again. The distant thunder of hooves and the clash of steel reached their ears first as a tremor, then as a storm. The enemy army had arrived at the capital gates, their banners silhouetted against the rising sun, their advance unstoppable. The city trembled beneath the weight of inevitability, and Mira felt it ripple through the temple, through the palace tunnels, through every stone that had once been silent witness to her legacy. The visions of fire and blood she had tried to keep at bay now stood at the threshold, reality converging with prophecy. They were no longer alone in their struggle. Fate had cornered them, the past and future colliding in a single impossible moment. And Mira understood with absolute clarity that what had been inevitable could now be rewritten, but only if she chose to embrace the power that surged through her and face the storm at the gates. Flames licked the edges of the city walls, black smoke curling into a sky already heavy with ash. And Mira felt it all, the roar of collapse, the cries of the innocent, the pulse of destiny thrumming beneath her feet. She had fled from fate for centuries, fleeing the weight of love that had always demanded sacrifice. Yet now the world demanded she stand. Every vision, every loss, every echo of a past life pressed against her, and in that moment she understood. Running had never saved her, but standing could change everything. Kael moved beside her, battered but unwavering, the bond between them a living current that pulsed with anticipation and fury. His presence was not a leash, not a command, but a mirror of what she had refused to see in herself: strength, courage, and the capacity to choose. The silver glow beneath her skin expanded, spilling into the air like molten light, a testament to the power she had denied. She was not the scared girl who had once trembled at his gaze. She was the first Luna reborn, a force centuries in the making, and the fire she carried within her now burned with purpose rather than fear. The enemy pressed forward, but Mira's awareness had grown sharper than any blade, quicker than any army. Every heartbeat resonated with Kael's, every breath synchronized with the rhythm of her power. Where she moved, the wind and light bent to her will, shaping the battlefield, deflecting destruction, and twisting inevitability into a form she could command. It was no longer Kael she was protecting alone. It was the future, the realm, the countless lives that had depended on them even before they had been born. And then they unleashed it, together. Their bond, once a whisper across lifetimes, roared through the night like lightning fracturing the sky. Magic and blood, destiny and desire, history and love fused in a torrent so brilliant it seared the air and shattered the chains of fate. The enemy reeled as centuries of power, long dormant in Mira's veins and amplified by the Alpha King at her side, rewrote every outcome they had anticipated. Walls cracked, steel bent, and the shadow of doom retreated before the force of two souls who refused to surrender to prophecy. When the battle stilled, when the smoke cleared and the first timid rays of dawn touched the scarred city, Kael knelt before her, not as a king commanding submission, but as a man seeking truth. He looked at her with eyes that had seen centuries of longing and finally understood the depth of what she had chosen. He did not demand her loyalty, did not bend protocol to his will. He waited silently, and in that moment, every pulse of the bond between them trembled with unspoken acknowledgement. She was not running anymore. She had embraced herself, her power, and the love that had waited patiently through centuries of denial. Cal extended nothing but the question she had already answered with every heartbeat. The city could burn, armies could fall, and kingdoms could rise or collapse. But she would stand. She would fight. She would love. And in that choice lay the truth. Some destinies are not written, they are seized. Stop running. Stand with her. Witness what happens when love refuses to be denied.